A cruel diner owner shouted at a young pregnant woman in front of everyone, calling her worthless and demanding she leave his restaurant. When she tried to defend herself, he slapped her so hard she fell to the floor, clutching her belly in pain. The crowded diner went silent. No one dared to move. No one dared to help. The arrogant man smirked, believing he ruled this small seaside town with money and fear. But he had no idea. Her husband was a Navy SEAL, and at that very moment, he and his loyal canine partner were about to walk through that door. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The sun was sinking low over the coast of Maine, painting the horizon in soft amber and rose. The ocean stretched endlessly, its calm surface whispering against the rocks that framed the quiet town of Blue Harbor. The air smelled of salt and pine, the kind of air that reminded Ethan Walker of everything he'd missed: freedom, silence, and the sound of waves instead of gunfire. After 14 months on deployment in the Middle East, he was finally home. Ethan's pickup truck rumbled down the narrow coastal road, the engine echoing through the stillness. The man behind the wheel looked older than his 34 years. His short, dark hair had a few new streaks of gray since he'd last driven these roads, and the faint scar along his left temple caught the fading sunlight whenever he turned. His face was tanned, weathered, strong, the face of a man who had spent too long in the sun, too long under orders, too long without rest. His expression was calm, but his blue-gray eyes, steady and sharp, betrayed the quiet watchfulness of someone who no longer knew what it meant to relax. On the passenger seat sat Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat that gleamed like armor in the light. The dog sat upright, eyes focused ahead, his posture military even now. Rex had been Ethan's canine partner for 5 years, in Afghanistan, Syria, and the kind of unnamed places where soldiers went without medals or recognition. He was intelligent, loyal, and unnervingly perceptive, able to sense Ethan's unease before even Ethan could name it. As they neared the town, Rex let out a low, quiet whine. Ethan reached over and scratched behind his ear. "Yeah," he murmured. "I smell it too. Home." The first houses appeared, small wooden cottages with peeling paint, boats pulled onto dry land for the season, and the familiar neon glow of the seaside diner. Blue Harbor hadn't changed much. It was still the same sleepy fishing town with a single gas station, a post office that closed too early, and neighbors who knew everything about each other, or at least thought they did. Ethan turned onto Harbor Lane and slowed as the old white cottage came into view. The porch light was on, and the curtains fluttered gently in the ocean breeze. For a moment, he just sat there in the truck, gripping the steering wheel, his heart pounding harder than it had on any battlefield. Then the front door opened. Grace Miller Walker stepped out onto the porch. She was 27, with soft honey blonde hair tied loosely behind her head, a few loose strands glinting in the light. Her skin was pale, kissed by the sea wind, and her sea-green eyes glowed with that quiet mix of relief and disbelief that only comes from waiting too long. Her pregnancy was visible now, the gentle curve beneath her dress, the tender way she held one hand to her stomach as if cradling both herself and the life inside her. When she saw him step out of the truck, she froze. For a heartbeat, the world went still. No gulls, no waves, just the wind and the sound of her breath catching in her throat. Then she ran to him, her bare feet slapping against the wooden steps. "Ethan!" she cried, her voice trembling with joy and tears. He caught her in his arms, holding her close, feeling her heartbeat beneath his hands. Her scent, salt and warmth and lavender soap, erased the smell of sand and diesel that had lived in his clothes for months. Rex circled them, tail wagging slowly, his ears perked as if guarding the reunion. Grace crouched down to stroke his fur, laughing softly through her tears. "Hey, big guy," she whispered. "Still keeping him safe, huh?" Ethan smiled faintly. "He keeps me human," he said, his voice low, gravelly from disuse. Inside the house, everything was both familiar and new. Grace had rearranged the furniture since he'd left, added soft curtains, painted the walls a pale blue. The smell of baked bread lingered in the air, and 2 coffee mugs sat waiting on the table. On the mantel were framed photos, Ethan in uniform, Rex beside him in full vest. Their wedding photo, barefoot on the beach, laughing as if nothing bad could ever touch them. Dinner was simple, soup and bread, eaten between glances that said more than words could. Ethan spoke little. His voice carried a quiet weight. Grace filled the silence with small talk about the town, about how business at the diner had been slow, about the mayor's new project, something about turning the old harbor area into a luxury resort. "They call it Harbor Lux," she said with a small shrug. "The mayor says it'll bring jobs, but it won't," Ethan finished softly. "It'll bring outsiders." She smiled faintly. "You always see through things." He didn't tell her that he'd seen this pattern everywhere, promises of progress that hid corruption underneath. He didn't want to cloud her peace. After dinner, Grace stood by the window, hands resting on her belly, watching the sea darken under the gathering dusk. "He's been moving a lot," she said softly. "I think he knows you're home." Ethan came up behind her, his large hand covering hers. "I'll make sure he grows up safe," he said. The words were quiet but full of conviction. There was a knock on the door. Grace startled slightly, but Ethan's posture didn't change. He walked to the door and opened it to find Hank Bell, the mayor of Blue Harbor, standing outside. Hank was a man in his late 50s, tall and broad with thinning silver hair slicked back, his face ruddy from too much whiskey and self-importance. He wore a dark overcoat and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Evenin', son," Hank said warmly. "Heard you were back in town. Thought I'd stop by and welcome our hero home." Ethan kept his hand on the doorframe, body still, polite but distant. "Appreciate that," he said flatly. Hank's gaze flicked past Ethan into the house, toward Grace. "And this must be the lovely Mrs. Walker," he said, his tone too familiar. "Blue Harbor's lucky to have folks like you back. Maybe you'll even find a place in the mayor's committee one day, once that baby's here." Grace forced a polite smile, discomfort flashing briefly in her eyes. Ethan noticed. The mayor chuckled, stepping back. "Say, about that property of yours. Fine location by the cliff. Perfect view of the bay. You ever think of selling? I could connect you with some investors from out of town. Big project, Harbor Lux, they call it. Gonna make this place shine." Ethan's jaw tightened. "It's not for sale." For a moment, Hank's smile faltered, just enough to show the steel beneath. Then he laughed again, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. Of course not. Just a friendly suggestion. You take care now, both of you." He turned to leave, his shoes crunching on the gravel as he disappeared into the dusk. Ethan closed the door slowly. Grace touched his arm. "He always makes me uncomfortable," she said quietly. "Stay away from him," Ethan replied. Men who smile that much usually have something to hide. The evening grew colder. Grace curled up on the couch, resting her head against Ethan's shoulder. For a while, they just listened. The rain starting to fall, the waves outside, Rex's slow breathing near the door. For the first time in months, Ethan felt something close to peace, though a small, unrelenting edge of caution still lingered at the back of his mind. Later, when Grace was asleep, he stepped outside with Rex. The rain had stopped, leaving the world slick and shining. The lighthouse beam swept across the sea, pale gold against the night. The air was heavy with salt and the promise of another storm. Grace woke when he came back in. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Just needed the air." "Come with me," she said, taking his hand. They walked together down to the shore, their steps slow, the sand damp beneath their feet. The sea murmured quietly, as if listening. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, her belly pressing gently against his arm. "You'll like being home again," she whispered. "You'll see." Ethan looked out at the horizon. The lighthouse light reflected in her eyes, soft, steady, unknowing. He wanted to believe her, but something inside him wouldn't settle. He'd learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were whispering danger. Rex stopped suddenly, his body tense, ears erect. Ethan followed his gaze up the hill, toward the edge of the main road. There, half hidden behind a stand of trees, a black SUV sat motionless. Its headlights were off, its engine silent, but he could see the faint glint of metal in the moonlight. And he knew, without doubt, that someone inside was watching them. Grace didn't notice. She was still smiling faintly, lost in the sound of waves and the glow of the lighthouse. Ethan put an arm around her shoulders and drew her closer, his expression calm, though his pulse had quickened. "Beautiful night," she murmured. "Yeah," he said softly, eyes fixed on the SUV. "Beautiful, but not quiet." As the lighthouse beam swept across the water once more, the black vehicle lingered in the darkness, unmoving, its presence a shadow against the peace they thought they'd found. The storm over Blue Harbor had not yet begun, but it was coming. The morning light over Blue Harbor arrived pale and cold, spilling across the bay like a veil of mist. The town was just waking. Fishermen untied their boats. The sound of gulls echoed over the water, and the faint smell of bacon and coffee drifted from the small cluster of buildings that made up the town center. Grace Walker, wrapped in her gray coat and scarf, made her way down the sloping street toward the seaside diner. Her steps were slow, careful. 7 months pregnant now, she felt the weight of both her child and the need to help with the household expenses. The diner sat on the corner overlooking the harbor, a squat white and blue building with a neon sign that flickered, "See, Dine, See, Dine," because one of the bulbs had been broken for months. Inside, the walls were lined with old photographs of fishing boats and faded newspaper clippings about the town's golden days. It was one of the few places in Blue Harbor that still felt alive, though lately, even that life seemed fragile. Grace pushed open the door, greeted by the familiar sound of the bell above it. Behind the counter stood Rick Dalton, the diner's owner. Rick was a man in his early 50s, with thinning blonde hair, slicked back with too much gel, and a round belly pressing against his stained apron. His face was broad and ruddy, his blue eyes perpetually narrowed, as if suspicious of the world. A thin scar cut across his chin, a reminder of a bar fight years ago, according to local gossip. Rick had once been charming in his younger days, But years of debt, cheap whiskey, and bitterness had turned that charm into a sour arrogance. He had connections, small time, but enough to make him dangerous. He worked closely with Carl Mendez, the developer behind the Harbor Lux project, and acted as Mendez's voice inside Blue Harbor. "Well, look who decided to show up early," Rick said as Grace slipped behind the counter. "Morning, sweetheart." Grace forced a polite smile. "Morning, Mr. Dalton." "You hear the news?" he asked, leaning close. "Your soldier husband's back in town." His tone made the word soldier sound like a joke. "Yes," Grace replied softly, reaching for a coffee pot. "He got back yesterday." Rick smirked, tossing a towel over his shoulder. "Guess that means you'll quit soon, huh? Now that you've got your hero home to take care of you." She kept her eyes on the pot. "I plan to keep working, sir." That seemed to amuse him. A pregnant woman slinging coffee while her big tough Navy SEAL sits at home? That's cute. Guess he's not much of a provider, huh? Grace froze, the coffee dripping onto the counter. Around them, a few customers turned to glance, sensing tension but pretending to stay busy. Chloe Mason, a young waitress barely 22, shot Grace a worried look. Chloe was small and quick, with curly brown hair tied up in a messy bun and freckles dusting her nose. She had worked at the diner since she was 16 and had learned early that standing up to Rick was a losing battle. But she admired Grace, her calm, her quiet dignity. "Mr. Dalton, that's enough," Grace said finally, her voice trembling but firm. "I don't appreciate—" She didn't get to finish. Rick's hand slammed down on the counter, making the silverware jump. "Don't appreciate what?" he snapped. "You think you're better than me? Because your husband plays war while the rest of us keep this town running?" The diner went still. Even the radio behind the counter seemed to hush. Grace took a small step back, her hand instinctively covering her stomach. "Please," she said quietly. "Not in front of everyone." Rick's face darkened, and before anyone could react, he reached out and shoved her shoulder. Not hard enough to knock her over, but enough to make her stumble. "You don't tell me what to do in my place, sweetheart," he growled. The sound of the diner door opening cut through the tension. The small bell jingled softly, almost out of place in the heavy silence. Ethan Walker stood in the doorway, the morning sun behind him casting his silhouette long across the floor. He wore a dark flannel shirt over a plain white t-shirt, his posture relaxed but alert. His eyes swept the room once, calm, assessing, before resting on his wife, who stood pale and shaken by the counter. Beside him, Rex padded in quietly, his ears twitching, his movements smooth and purposeful. The big German shepherd didn't bark. He didn't need to. His very presence made every head in the diner turn. Ethan's voice was calm, but cut through the air like a blade. "Step away from her." Rick turned, the sneer returning to his lips. "Oh, look who it is. The war hero." He spread his arms mockingly. "What's the matter, soldier boy? Can't fight real men anymore, so you pick on small-town folk?" Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "I said step away." Rick chuckled, but there was an uneasy flicker in his eyes, something animal, instinctive, that told him he was dealing with a predator. "This is my diner," he said, forcing a laugh. "You don't walk in here giving orders." Before anyone could blink, Rick took a step closer to Grace, and Ethan moved. It was fast, efficient, controlled. His hand caught Rick's wrist mid-motion, twisting it downward while his other hand gripped the back of Rick's neck. With a firm but practiced motion, he pinned him against the counter, immobilized but unharmed. The room fell dead silent except for Rick's muffled grunt. Rex stood at Ethan's side, lips curled slightly, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Ethan's voice was soft, controlled. "If you ever touch her again, I won't stop at warning you." For a moment, no one breathed. Then Ethan released him and stepped back. Rick stumbled, red-faced, humiliated more by the lack of effort it took than by the pain. He straightened, glaring at Ethan with the hatred of a man whose pride had just been stripped bare. "You'll regret this," Rick hissed. "People around here know better than to cross me." Ethan didn't answer. He helped Grace steady herself, his touch gentle, his expression unreadable. Chloe, trembling, pulled her phone from her apron pocket and discreetly tapped the record button. Outside, the sound of tires crunching on gravel announced the arrival of another presence, a dark patrol car rolling up to the curb. The door opened, and Sheriff Dale Harper stepped out. Harper was in his mid-40s, tall but soft around the middle, his sandy hair thinning and his mustache too carefully trimmed. His uniform was neatly pressed, but his eyes had the weary look of a man who'd long since traded integrity for convenience. He was known in Blue Harbor as easygoing, which really meant easy to buy. He was friendly with the mayor, and everyone knew it. "What's all this?" Harper said as he entered the diner, hands on his belt. "Heard there was trouble." Rick pointed immediately at Ethan. "That's him. This guy came in here, assaulted me in front of my customers." Grace started to speak, but Ethan raised a hand slightly, silencing her. Harper looked between them, then at Rex, whose golden eyes were still locked on Rick. The sheriff's voice lowered, carrying a quiet warning. "You just got back, didn't you, Walker? Maybe take it easy. This town doesn't need any trouble." Ethan's gaze met his evenly. "My wife was assaulted. Maybe this town needs someone to care." A flicker of irritation crossed Harper's face. "I'm telling you, let it go. We handle things our way here." The words were polite, but the tone was a threat. Ethan said nothing more. He placed a steady hand on Grace's shoulder and guided her toward the door. As they passed the sheriff, Rex gave a low, deliberate growl, teeth flashing for an instant. The sound made Harper flinch before he quickly covered it with a laugh. Outside, the cold wind hit them, carrying the scent of the sea. Grace was trembling. "Ethan," she whispered, "they're all on the same side." He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the diner window, where Rick stood watching them, a smile twisting his face. Ethan's voice, when it came, was low and steady. "Then we'll see what happens when they meet someone who isn't afraid of them." Rex barked once, short, sharp, like the snap of a command. The storm over Blue Harbor was gathering, and Ethan Walker could feel it in his bones. The wind that morning carried the faint smell of rain and seaweed, a strange calmness that felt heavier than silence. The town of Blue Harbor was already buzzing, whispers spreading faster than the gulls circling above the docks. People at the post office spoke in low voices. The fishermen at the pier leaned closer over their nets, and every table in the seaside diner seemed to murmur the same question. "Did you see the video?" Inside their small cottage overlooking the bay, Grace Walker sat at the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she tried to button her cardigan. Her reflection in the mirror looked pale. Dark circles shadowed her sea-green eyes. 7 months pregnant, the shock from the day before still lingered in her veins. She could still feel Rick's hand shoving her, could still hear the hush of the diner as the crowd froze in fear. Her stomach tightened as a wave of panic rose. not for herself, but for the fragile life growing inside her. Ethan entered quietly, carrying a cup of tea. He had changed into a dark Henley shirt and jeans, but his posture was still that of a soldier, upright, alert, scanning every corner without even realizing it. He set the cup down gently beside her. "You need to rest," he said softly. Grace forced a shaky smile. "I can't. What if someone comes? What if—" He crouched in front of her, taking her cold hands into his. "No one's going to hurt you, not while I'm here." His voice was calm, but his eyes, those gray-blue eyes that once looked through dust storms and chaos, were sharp with calculation. He had spent most of the night awake, replaying everything in his head. Rick's arrogance, the sheriff's warning, the black SUV from the night before. None of it felt like coincidence. Blue Harbor was small, yes, but not simple. There was something rotten beneath its surface, something organized. Rex padded over, resting his head gently on Grace's knee. His golden brown fur shimmered in the morning light, his ears twitching as if picking up sounds no human could. The German shepherd had sensed her distress, and his deep amber eyes followed her every movement with quiet protectiveness. Grace stroked his head, the rhythmic motion calming her heartbeat. "He knows," she whispered. "He always knows." "He does," Ethan replied, glancing out the window toward the road below. "That's why he stays close." By midday, Ethan had already been into town once. He moved quietly through familiar streets, talking little, watching everything. The townspeople gave him that half-smile people reserve for heroes they don't really know. Admiration mixed with discomfort. He stopped at a small general store run by Sarah Coleman, a woman in her 40s with a round face, warm hazel eyes, and hair the color of copper leaves tied back in a loose bun. Sarah had lived in Blue Harbor her whole life. She knew who owed money, who drank too much, and who feared the mayor. She looked up from the register as Ethan entered. "I saw the video," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "That man, Rick, he's been trouble since Mendez started coming around." Ethan's expression didn't change. "Mendez, the developer?" Sarah nodded, glancing toward the window as if the very name might summon trouble. "Carl Mendez," she said, lowering her voice. "Came from out of state a few years ago. Started buying up property along the coast. Old fishermen's lots, unused warehouses. Promised to build a luxury resort that'd bring life back to town. But people who refused to sell." She hesitated. "Accidents, fires, inspections that never cleared. You didn't hear it from me." Ethan gave a slight nod of thanks. "You didn't tell me anything." As he left, Sarah's eyes lingered on him. She'd seen that kind of quiet determination before, the kind that meant trouble was about to find its way here, one way or another. By evening, the video Chloe Mason had recorded had already spread online. It wasn't long, just 30 seconds, but it captured everything. Rick shoving Grace, Ethan stepping in, the silent crowd watching. The clip went viral across the state. On social media, people began to ask questions. Who is this man? Why did the sheriff side with the attacker? The calm of Blue Harbor was cracking. Meanwhile, in a small rented motel room near the town's edge, a young journalist named Miles Turner watched the video on his laptop for the 10th time. Miles was 29, thin but athletic, with sharp brown eyes behind a pair of black-rimmed glasses and dark curls that refused to stay neat. He had once been a field reporter for a Boston newspaper before a story exposing a corrupt senator cost him his job. Since then, he'd been freelancing, chasing truth wherever it tried to hide. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. "This isn't just some diner fight," he muttered. "This smells like control." Beside him, a stack of old articles and property records lay scattered across the bed, all tracing back to Harbor Lux Development LLC. Each trail led to one name: Carl Mendez. Miles closed his laptop, grabbed his camera, and stepped outside. The air was cold, the wind rising again off the water. He zipped up his jacket, pulled his hood low, and began walking toward town. He had heard the name Ethan Walker before. There was something familiar about it. Maybe it had been in a military report or an old news clipping about Navy SEALs. He'd find out soon enough. Back at the cottage, night settled quickly. Grace had fallen asleep on the couch, a soft blanket over her. The fire flickered low, casting gold light across her face. Ethan sat at the table, a laptop open in front of him. Several papers spread around: property maps, business licenses, and tax records. His military precision had shifted into investigative discipline. He'd accessed public databases, tracing connections between Rick Dalton, Mayor Hank Bell, and Carl Mendez. The same three names kept circling back, connected by false addresses, shared phone numbers, and a shadow company listed in New York. Rex sat near the window, motionless except for his eyes. He was listening, always listening. Every creak of the house, every change in the wind. When the clock struck 11, Ethan stood and walked to the door. He stepped outside, the night air cutting cold against his skin. The wind off the sea had grown stronger, carrying with it the faint whistle of shifting tides, and something else. He couldn't explain it, but years of combat had tuned his instincts too finely to ignore. Something was off. He circled the perimeter of the house, flashlight in hand. The beam caught only the glisten of wet grass and the white fence that framed their yard. Then, near the corner of the house, something flickered. A shadow moving where it shouldn't have been. "Rex," he whispered. The dog was already moving before the word finished leaving his lips. Rex darted toward the window, teeth bared, his growl deep and dangerous. The movement was quick. A human figure crouched near the back window, dressed in dark clothing, face hidden. When Rex lunged, the intruder bolted into the trees, vanishing into the darkness before Ethan could reach him. He chased to the edge of the property, stopping just as the forest swallowed the last trace of the man. The only sound left was the wind, restless and alive. Ethan stood there for a moment, the beam of his flashlight steady. Someone had been watching them. The house, the window, maybe even Grace. When he returned inside, Grace had stirred awake, alarm in her voice. "What happened?" He closed the door, bolting it. "Nothing," he said quietly. "Just the wind." But his expression told another story. He crouched beside Rex, rubbing his fur. The dog's heart was still pounding beneath his hand. "Good boy," he murmured. "They're watching us now." Outside, the wind rose, carrying whispers through the trees. Faint, hollow, and full of warning. The storm that had been circling Blue Harbor for days finally broke that night. Heavy rain lashed against the rooftops, and the wind howled through the narrow streets as though the sea itself had come ashore to reclaim the town. Inside City Hall, where the windows rattled and the old oak beams groaned, two men sat in the dim glow of a desk lamp. Mayor Hank Bell leaned forward, his round face glistening with sweat despite the cold. The years of whiskey and easy power had softened him, but not his greed. He wore a dark wool suit, the buttons straining against his stomach. His gray hair was slicked back with oil, and his blue tie was the exact shade of arrogance he wore every day. Across from him sat Carl Mendez, a man in his early 40s, with sharp cheekbones, olive skin, and the kind of confidence that came from having dirt on everyone worth knowing. He was clean-shaven, handsome in a predatory way, with dark brown hair and calculating eyes that seemed to weigh every person like an investment. Mendez had made his fortune in urban revitalization projects, a phrase that usually meant destroying something pure and selling the remains for profit. The mayor spoke first, his voice low but trembling with anger. "That Navy SEAL's making me look like a damn fool, Carl. The video's everywhere. You seen it? People are talking. Some even think he's a hero." Mendez leaned back, lighting a cigarette. The flare of the match briefly lit his face, showing a small scar under his jaw, a remnant of a bar fight long ago when he still did his own dirty work. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled toward the ceiling. "Heroes don't last long in small towns, Hank. You just have to remind him that he's not welcome here." Hank rubbed his temples. "He's not just some drifter. He owns that land by the cliffs, right in the middle of the Harbor Lux expansion. Without it, the investors are getting cold feet." Mendez smirked. "Then we warm them up. Fear works better than money sometimes. You said his wife's pregnant?" The mayor nodded uneasily. 7 months, I think." "Good." Mendez stubbed his cigarette out in the ashtray. "We'll use that. People like him. Soldiers. They don't fold when you threaten them. But family? That's their weakness." The rain outside grew heavier. Mendez stood and walked toward the window, watching the blurred lights of the town below. "I'll send one of my men to keep an eye on her. Maybe she gets a few mysterious phone calls. A stranger outside the house. Fear makes people desperate to sell." He turned, his smile cold. "You'll get your land. I'll get my resort. Everybody wins." The mayor didn't reply right away. His conscience, what little remained, flickered like the dying bulb above them. "Carl, don't go too far." Mendez laughed softly. "You hired me because I do go too far." Across town, Grace Walker stood by the window of their small cottage, the storm reflected in her eyes. Lightning flashed over the bay, illuminating her face for a heartbeat. Soft, young, full of fear, and something deeper, endurance. The baby had started to kick again, rhythmic and strong, as if reminding her that life still fought to exist, even when the world around it seemed to crumble. She pressed her hand to her stomach and whispered, "It's okay, little one. Daddy's here." In the next room, Ethan worked quietly at his desk, reviewing the names and documents he'd collected. His handwriting was neat, the kind of precision drilled into him during years of classified missions. He'd managed to trace Harbor Lux Development LLC through a web of shell companies, all connected to Mendez. But he still needed proof, something tangible that could expose the corruption publicly. Rex lay at his feet, half asleep but alert, his ears twitching at every distant sound. The dog had become even more protective lately, shadowing Grace whenever she moved. Grace appeared at the doorway. "You haven't slept?" she said softly. Ethan looked up, offering a tired smile. "You either." "I can't. Every time the wind hits the window, I feel like someone's out there watching." He rose, crossing to her, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Then let them watch. I'll make sure they regret it." Before she could answer, a loud clap of thunder made her jump. Ethan pulled her close, whispering something only she could hear, something that made her smile faintly even through her fear. The next afternoon, the storm passed, leaving the streets slick and shining. In the diner parking lot, Chloe Mason stood outside with a small cardboard box in her hands, her belongings, a name tag, a notebook, a pen that no longer worked. Rick Dalton had fired her that morning, accusing her of betrayal for leaking the video. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, though she tried to stand tall. Chloe had always been quick to laugh, but today her freckles stood out against skin pale from shock. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Rick had shouted. "You'll never work in this town again." Now she sat in her beat-up red hatchback, the box beside her, staring at her phone. She had one new message, an email address left by a stranger. MilesTurnerReportsIgmail.com. Attached was a note. "If you have information about Blue Harbor's corruption, I can protect your identity." Chloe hesitated. She thought about Grace's face, about the look in Ethan's eyes when he protected her. Finally, she attached the original video file and clicked Send. That evening, the mayor's office was quiet except for the ticking of a brass clock. Hank Bell stared out the window at the harbor lights while sipping from a half-empty tumbler of whiskey. He felt trapped. The kind of man who'd sold too much of his soul to men like Mendez and now found he had nothing left to buy it back. The door opened without a knock. A man in a black raincoat stepped in, tall, with a long scar down his cheek and cold gray eyes. His name was Vince Kearney, one of Mendez's enforcers, though he liked to think of himself as a problem solver. He'd been a Marine once, dishonorably discharged after a fight that left a superior officer hospitalized. Now, he was a man who followed orders for cash, not conscience. "Mendez sent me," Vince said simply. His voice was deep, calm, the kind that could sound polite and threatening at once. "He wants the family watched." Hank swallowed hard, nodding. "Just watch. No trouble, you hear?" Vince's smirk was thin. "Sure, Mayor." He turned and left, the door closing behind him with a soft click. At home, Ethan sat in his truck, tinkering with a small GPS tracker he had hidden beneath the dashboard. He'd learned long ago that paranoia was often just preparation misunderstood. As he reconnected the wires, something caught his eye. A faint metallic glint tucked beneath the steering column where it didn't belong. He froze, instincts kicking in. Using a small knife from his pocket, he pried the object loose. It was a tiny black device, a bug, no larger than a coin. His pulse quickened. He turned it over, noticing a small engraving on the side. HD LLC. Harbor Development, LC. He looked around the driveway, scanning the shadows. The night was quiet except for the hum of distant crickets and the rhythmic waves beyond the hill. Then near the edge of the property, a figure moved. A man crouching beside the fence, half hidden by the darkness. Ethan stepped out of the truck silently, his boots crunching lightly against the gravel. The man didn't hear him until it was too late. Ethan's arm locked around his neck from behind, pulling him down without a sound. The intruder struggled briefly before freezing as Ethan pressed the knife gently against his throat. "Who sent you?" Ethan whispered. The man gasped, eyes wide with fear. "Mendez, Harbor Development. They just said to plant it." Ethan searched him, finding an ID card clipped inside his jacket. Harbor Development LLC, Vince Kearney. But this wasn't Vince himself, just one of his men. Ethan released him just enough to speak. "You go back and tell them this. If they come near my family again, they won't walk away next time." He shoved the man toward the road, watching him stumble into the darkness. Rex appeared beside him a moment later, growling softly as if sharing his rage. Ethan looked down at the bug still in his hand. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint scent of salt and rain. "They're coming closer, boy," he murmured. "It's time we find out how deep this goes." The storm came without warning, rolling in from the Atlantic with the fury of a god scorned. Rain hammered against the roof of the Walkers' cottage, thunder shaking the glass panes. The world outside was nothing but darkness and noise, broken only by flashes of lightning that painted the cliffs in silver and shadow. Inside, Ethan moved through the house in silence, his every sense sharpened. Something was wrong. Rex's low growl had started an hour earlier, before the wind had even risen. It wasn't the growl of a dog hearing thunder. It was the quiet rumble of warning, the sound of instinct before danger. Grace lay on the couch, clutching her belly. Her face was pale, beads of sweat clinging to her temples despite the cold air. "Ethan," she whispered through a shallow breath, "it hurts more than before." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from pain. The contractions had started early, and she knew their child wasn't waiting for a safer time to arrive. Ethan knelt beside her, brushing her damp hair from her face. His touch was gentle, his voice calm. The way a man sounds when he's terrified but refuses to show it. "It's okay. Just breathe, sweetheart. We'll get through this." But even as he said the words, his eyes flicked toward the window where rain streaked down in restless patterns. The soldier in him couldn't ignore the signs, too many shadows moving where there should have been none. Rex stood by the door, muscles taut, his golden brown fur darkened by the dim light. He was 6 years old, a veteran in his own right, trained for combat and loyalty. Every sound outside seemed to register in his amber eyes. He gave a short, warning bark and looked back at Ethan as if to say, "They're here." Lightning split the sky. For an instant, Ethan saw movement near the tree line. 3, maybe 4 figures advancing through the storm. They moved fast and low, carrying something long and metallic that glinted in the flash. "Grace," Ethan said quietly, rising to his feet. "Get down behind the couch. Don't move until I tell you." Her eyes widened. "Ethan, no." He kissed her forehead, cutting her off. "You trust me?" She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "Then do as I say." He grabbed his sidearm from the drawer, an old Sig Sauer military issue, and loaded it with smooth, practiced precision. The world around him slowed, that eerie calm before violence he knew too well. Rain pounded harder against the roof, thunder rolling over the cliffs like the drums of war. Outside, the first of Mendez's men reached the porch. He was tall and thickly built, his face obscured by a black hood, boots sloshing in the mud. Behind him came 2 others, one short and wiry with a jagged tattoo crawling up his neck, the other bald with a cruel grin that flashed in the lightning. Their leader, Vince Kearney, stood further back, watching from the shadows with his usual calm. His scarred face looked almost serene as the wind whipped his coat. Vince raised a hand, signaling the others. "Make it quick," he shouted over the rain. "We're just sending a message." The door burst open. Ethan moved before the intruder could finish stepping inside. A clean, efficient strike to the wrist sent the man's crowbar clattering to the floor. A quick elbow followed, then a knee to the ribs. The attacker crumpled without a sound. The second man lunged in from the side, swinging a flashlight like a club. Ethan ducked, the light grazing his shoulder. He countered with a punch to the throat, sending the man stumbling back into the wall. Rex was already in motion. With a deep snarl, he launched himself at the third assailant, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's forearm. The attacker screamed, trying to shake the dog loose, but Rex held firm, his muscles rippling under his soaked fur. Lightning illuminated the struggle, the beast and the brute, locked in primal fury. "Rex, down!" Ethan shouted. The dog obeyed instantly, dropping back just as Ethan tackled the wounded man to the ground and disarmed him. The scent of blood mixed with rain and gun oil. Grace cried out from behind the couch, a sound of pain and fear. "Ethan, it's coming!" He turned toward her, heart twisting. "Hold on, Grace!" Before he could reach her, a shot rang out. The bullet shattered a picture frame above his head, showering glass across the room. Vince Kearney stood in the doorway now, his gun steady, his expression unreadable. "You should have stayed out of this, Walker," Vince said. His voice was deep, even, a man used to speaking before he kills. Ethan stepped in front of Grace, his own weapon raised. "You came to my house. You crossed a line you can't uncross." Vince tilted his head slightly. "We're just businessmen, soldier. You made this personal." Rex growled, baring his teeth. The sound was low and lethal. "Tell your men to stand down," Ethan said. Vince smiled. "You first." The standoff broke in an instant. Another flash of lightning, another gunshot, this one hitting the doorframe inches from Ethan's shoulder. He fired back twice, forcing Vince to duck behind the porch railing. One of the injured attackers scrambled to his feet and tried to grab Grace, but Rex lunged again, knocking the man flat and holding him down with a snarl that vibrated through the floorboards. Ethan moved fast, striking Vince's gun hand as he tried to rise. The pistol flew into the mud outside. They fought hand to hand now, a brutal, silent exchange of strikes, each man trained, each one unwilling to back down. Vince's fist caught Ethan's jaw. Ethan countered with a knee to his stomach. They crashed through the doorway, into the storm, rolling in the mud and rain. Finally, Ethan pinned Vince down, his arm locked around his throat. "You tell Mendez this," he hissed over the thunder. "You come near my family again, I'll bury every one of you under this damn cliff." He released the man, shoving him aside. Vince staggered back, gasping for air, clutching his throat. Then he stumbled into the darkness, his remaining men dragging each other toward the trees. Ethan stood in the rain, breathing hard. His knuckles were bleeding, his shirt torn. Rex stood beside him, fur matted and wet, his chest rising fast but steady. Then he heard it. Grace's scream from inside, followed by silence, then a single piercing cry. He ran back into the house. The living room was in shambles. Broken glass, overturned furniture, rainwater pooling on the floor. Grace lay on the rug, trembling, her eyes wet with tears and exhaustion. In her arms, wrapped in a towel, was a small, wailing newborn. "It's a boy," she whispered weakly. "Ethan, it's Noah." For a moment, the chaos around them ceased to exist. Ethan fell to his knees beside her, his hands shaking as he touched the baby's tiny fingers. Rex approached carefully, sniffing the child before sitting down, his ears lowered as if in reverence. Outside, sirens began to wail somewhere in the distance. Maybe Miles had called for help. Maybe the storm had finally drawn the town's attention. Lightning flashed again, reflecting off the shattered window and the tears in Grace's eyes. Ethan pulled her close, holding both her and Noah as the fire from a broken lantern flickered in the corner, smoke curling into the rain. "They'll never touch you again," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but his heart burned with the cold fire of promise. As thunder rolled across the cliffs, the baby's cry rose again, not in fear, but as if declaring life's defiance against the darkness. The morning after the storm broke over Blue Harbor, the sea was eerily calm. Mist rolled in from the water, soft and white like breath against glass, veiling the jagged cliffs and the lighthouse that stood above them, a weather-beaten relic that had long since gone dark. Its stone walls were slick with age and salt, its iron door rusted but still locked. For most of the town, the old lighthouse was just a ghost on the horizon, but to Ethan Walker, it was beginning to look like the beating heart of the corruption-strangling Blue Harbor. He parked his truck at the base of the rocky hill, the engine idling softly in the fog. Beside him sat Miles Turner, the young journalist whose persistence had turned him from an observer into a partner in this quiet war. Miles wore a brown canvas jacket over a flannel shirt, his black hair flattened by the damp air, glasses streaked with rain. His once carefree curiosity had sharpened into purpose. There was a kind of quiet defiance in the way he carried his camera now, like a weapon aimed at truth. "You sure about this place?" Miles asked, adjusting the strap of his shoulder bag. "Locals say it's condemned." Ethan stepped out, scanning the cliffs with his usual measured calm. Condemned buildings make good hiding spots, especially for people with things to hide. Rex jumped from the truck bed, landing silently beside his master. His fur still carried the faint scent of smoke from the house fire 2 nights before. The dog's movements were precise and cautious, his ears twitching at the distant cry of gulls. They climbed toward the lighthouse through the wet grass and stones slick from rain. The door, heavy with rust, gave way with a groan when Ethan forced it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and iron. Dust swirled in the thin shafts of light cutting through cracks in the walls. Ethan's flashlight beam swept over broken furniture, old lanterns, and peeling wallpaper. Then something caught his eye. The outline of a trapdoor beneath the rotted floorboards. He knelt, pried it open, and found a narrow stairway descending into darkness. Miles whistled softly. Every good story starts with a staircase to hell. Ethan gave him a look. "Stay close." They descended into the damp, echoing basement. The beam of light revealed what time had hidden. A hidden office built within the lighthouse's foundation. There was a desk, a file cabinet, and a set of metal shelves lined with dusty boxes. A faded calendar on the wall read 2018, the year Carl Mendez's company had first registered Harbor Lux Development LLC. Miles brushed off one of the boxes and opened it. Inside were stacks of bank ledgers, signed checks, and sealed envelopes. "Holy hell," he breathed. "This is it." Ethan flipped through a folder marked Contracts. Dozens of photocopies bore the signature of Mayor Hank Bell. Transfer receipts linked the mayor's personal account to shell companies owned by Mendez. Other pages listed names, contractors, business owners, even police officers, next to cryptic notes like paid, compliant, or refused, handled. Then Miles found something else, a small wooden crate tucked beneath the desk. Inside were several old audio tapes labeled in faded ink. Meetings, BH and CM, sheriff, payoff, dock shipment. Ethan's eyes hardened. Recordings. Bell and Mendez must have kept these as leverage against their own men. Miles pulled out a portable player from his bag. The tape clicked and began to spin, crackling to life. The first voice was unmistakable, Mayor Bell's. "If that Navy man keeps asking questions, we shut him down. I don't care how." Another voice followed. Mendez's, calm and deliberate. "We'll make it look like a robbery, leave no witnesses, and if his wife gets in the way—" Miles stopped the tape, his face pale. "They were planning to kill you." Ethan's jaw clenched, but his tone stayed level. "Not the first time someone's tried." He packed the files into a waterproof case from his backpack. "We're taking everything." The sound of footsteps echoed from above. Rex's ears perked, his body lowering into a crouch. Ethan motioned for silence. The faint creak of wood came again. Someone moving inside the lighthouse. He signaled to Miles to turn off the flashlight. They waited in the dark, the smell of damp stone and sea thick around them. A soft knock came from the top of the stairs. "Ethan, it's me, Chloe." Ethan exhaled slowly and climbed the steps. Standing in the doorway was Chloe Mason, drenched from the rain, but still wearing her bright determination like armor. Her brown curls clung to her cheeks, and her eyes, sharp and steady, betrayed no fear. "I figured you'd be here," she said. "Mendez's guys have been driving around town asking questions about you. You've got maybe an hour before they figure out where you went." Miles blinked. "How did you—" "I followed them," Chloe said simply. "And before you ask, yes, I'm crazy." She pulled a small flash drive from her pocket. "I found this in Rick Dalton's office before I quit. It's encrypted financial data. Transactions from Mendez's company to offshore accounts." Ethan nodded approvingly. "You did good." Chloe grinned faintly, though her voice wavered. "Guess journalism's contagious." They spent the next half hour gathering everything: files, recordings, the drive, and uploading the data to a secure server using Miles's satellite connection. Outside, the fog began to thin, revealing the gray sweep of the ocean below. Meanwhile, back at the cottage, Grace sat by the window, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders as she nursed Noah. Her skin was still pale from the difficult birth, but her eyes glowed with quiet strength. She watched the waves and whispered to her son, "You'll grow up in a clean town, little one. No fear, no lies." Rex's distant bark carried on the wind, a sound she'd come to trust more than any siren. By dusk, Ethan and his companions had returned to Blue Harbor, their truck weighed down with evidence. They planned to deliver it all to Ethan's old contact in federal law enforcement, a man he hadn't spoken to in years, but who had once saved his life. They parked outside the sheriff's office, only to find smoke curling from a metal barrel behind the building. Sheriff Dale Harper stood there, sleeves rolled up, tossing files into the fire. The glow of burning paper flickered across his face, revealing panic beneath the sweat. Ethan approached quietly, his voice cold. "You picked the wrong night to clean house." The sheriff spun, startled. "Walker." Ethan stepped closer, holding up one of the burned folders he'd pulled from the ground. "Destroying evidence is a federal crime, Dale. You should have stayed lazy instead of stupid." Before Harper could reply, a black SUV pulled up, its engine humming low. A tall man stepped out, his presence commanding even in the dim light. He was in his early 40s, built like someone who still ran 6 miles before breakfast, with close-cropped brown hair and a stern but honest face. His badge gleamed under his raincoat, FBI Special Agent Daniel Carter. Carter extended a hand toward Ethan, his tone steady, but edged with history. "You never could stay out of trouble," Could you, Walker? Ethan gave a faint smirk. Good to see you too, sir. Carter glanced at the boxes of evidence, then at the trembling sheriff. Looks like you've been busy. Ethan handed him the case. Everything you need to shut down Mendez and Bell. Ledgers, recordings, wire transfers. It's all here. Carter nodded. We'll take it from here. Miles watched as the agents cuffed Sheriff Harper and loaded the files into the SUV. The journalist's camera captured the moment quietly, not for views, but for truth. Chloe stood beside him, her expression soft but resolute. Guess the story's finally out, she said. Not yet, Miles replied, but it's coming. As the lighthouse's beam, restored for the first time in years, swept across the horizon that night, Blue Harbor began to awaken from its long sleep. The dawn over Blue Harbor was cold and colorless, the kind of morning that carried silence before a storm. But this time, the storm was justice. Across the harbor, federal vehicles lined the streets, their headlights cutting through the fog. Men and women in dark jackets, marked FBI, moved in coordinated silence, radios crackling softly. The operation had a name now, Operation Harbor Light, a final push to cleanse the town that had drowned too long in corruption. Ethan stood by his truck, the wind tugging at his jacket. He wore a black tactical vest with a sidearm holstered at his hip, his expression carved from steel. Beside him, Special Agent Daniel Carter adjusted his earpiece and looked toward the horizon. You sure you're ready for this? Carter asked, his voice low. Ethan gave a small, grim smile. I've been ready since they came to my door. Rex sat obediently by his side, eyes focused, the golden tan fur along his back bristling in the cold. His front paw was still wrapped in a light bandage from the night before, a reminder of the attack that had nearly cost them everything. But his tail flicked once, steady and resolute. Miles and Chloe waited nearby with a small camera rig, documenting the unfolding operation for the federal records. Chloe, dressed in a dark windbreaker, looked nervous but determined. Miles, with his camera raised, murmured, "This isn't just a story anymore. It's history." Carter turned to his team. "You all know the plan. The mayor's under surveillance, Mendez's men are being rounded up, and the docks are sealed off. We move fast. No mistakes. This town's been held hostage long enough." He gestured, and the agents dispersed. At the seaside diner, where it had all begun, Rick Dalton sat behind the counter, nervously tapping his fingers. His once slicked hair was now unkempt, his apron stained with coffee. He'd been living like a man, waiting for the inevitable knock. When the door finally burst open and two agents entered, their guns drawn, Rick froze mid-step. "Rick Dalton," one of them said sharply. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and aiding organized crime." Rick's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hands shook as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. As he was led outside, townspeople gathered along the street, watching in stunned silence. For years, he'd barked orders at them, sneered at their fear. Now he was the one trembling. Across town, the sheriff's office was next. Sheriff Dale Harper was still in holding after his failed attempt to destroy evidence, but now he faced the full weight of federal charges. The man who had once strutted through the streets in his polished boots now sat behind bars, head hung low. Meanwhile, the real battle loomed at the waterfront. The docks stretched long and gray under the pale sky, the wooden planks slick with seawater. Fishing boats rocked gently against the tide, and at the far end, a luxury yacht sat waiting, The Aurora, Mendez's private escape route. Carl Mendez paced the deck, his immaculate white shirt untucked and stained with sweat. The mask of composure he'd always worn was gone, replaced by raw panic. His dark eyes darted toward the pier, where distant sirens grew louder. He was cornered, and he knew it. Beside him, Mayor Hank Bell. Thinner now, his gray hair disheveled, clutched a suitcase like a lifeline. "Carl, please," he stammered. "If we cooperate, maybe we can—" Mendez turned on him, face contorted. "You think they'll let us walk away? You signed every damn check, Hank. You're as deep in this as I am." The mayor's voice cracked. "I did it for the town." Mendez laughed bitterly. "You did it for yourself." Before either man could speak again, a flash of blue lights illuminated the docks. FBI vehicles skidded to a halt, agents spreading out with rifles raised. "Federal agents, drop your weapons and surrender." Mendez's eyes flicked to the side of the dock, a narrow escape ladder leading to a small motorboat. "We're not done yet," he muttered. But his path was cut off by Ethan and Carter, who had approached from the opposite end. Ethan's stance was calm but unyielding, his weapon steady. "It's over, Mendez. You've got nowhere left to run." Mendez sneered. "You don't get it, soldier. You think arresting me changes anything? The money's already moved. The deals are done." "Maybe," Ethan interrupted, his tone cold. "But this town won't live in your shadow anymore." A sudden shout broke the standoff. One of Mendez's men emerged from behind a crate, rifle raised. Carter spun, shouting, "Down!" The gunman opened fire, bullets sparking off metal. One round hit near the agents, sending shards of debris flying. In the chaos, an agent stumbled, pinned down behind a container. The gunman aimed again, but before he could fire, Rex leapt forward through the rain-slick air, colliding with him in a blur of fur and force. The man went down hard, weapon clattering into the water. Rex yelped as a stray splinter grazed his shoulder, but held his grip, keeping the attacker down until Ethan reached them. Carter called for medical support, glancing at Rex. "That dog just saved my man." Ethan knelt beside Rex, checking the wound. A shallow cut, bleeding, but not deep. He smiled faintly. "You'll live, old friend." The remaining agents advanced on the yacht. Mendez fired a desperate shot that missed wide, then ducked behind the railing. The mayor dropped his suitcase and raised his hands. "I'm done. I surrender," he cried, stumbling toward the agents. But Mendez wasn't finished. He grabbed a pistol from his belt, eyes wild, breath ragged. "You'll never take me alive," he shouted, stepping toward the edge of the dock. The gun trembled in his hand. Ethan saw it coming. The flash of metal, the twitch of Mendez's finger. Without hesitation, Rex lunged again, slamming into the man's arm. The gun fired once into the air before spinning out of Mendez's grasp and clattering into the sea. Mendez fell to his knees, clutching his wrist in pain. Ethan approached, his weapon aimed squarely at the man's chest. Rain poured harder, soaking them both as thunder rolled across the bay. Ethan's voice was steady and cold. "The sea takes back what it's owed." Carter stepped forward, cuffs ready. "Carl Mendez, you're under arrest for racketeering, money laundering, and attempted murder." As the agents led Mendez away, the lighthouse beam cut through the mist. Bright, unwavering. Townspeople began to gather along the shore, watching the scene unfold. Someone pointed at Rex, limping beside Ethan, and began to clap. Soon the sound grew. Applause mixed with tears. Miles filmed quietly from the pier. Chloe stood beside him, whispering, "Look at them. He's not just a dog anymore." He's the soul of this town. Ethan looked down at Rex, his hand resting on the dog's neck. He always was. For the first time in years, Blue Harbor felt like it could breathe. The corruption that had poisoned its waters was finally washing away, not with vengeance, but with light. A month had passed since the storm that changed Blue Harbor forever. Spring sunlight spilled gently across the coastal town, where salt air mingled with the scent of blooming hydrangeas. The sea, once shrouded in fog and fear, now shimmered in calm ripples that touched the docks like forgiving hands. The town was healing, its people, its streets, even its silence. Ethan Walker stood outside the newly painted wooden gate of his small training ground, a sign above it reading Harbor Rescue and K-9 Training Center. His broad frame was lean again, muscles toned from weeks of rebuilding fences and laying fresh gravel. The scars on his knuckles were faint reminders of battles both external and within. He wore a gray flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, sunlight catching in the faint silver streaks in his short dark hair. His face, once hardened by war and loss, now carried a quiet steadiness, the look of a man who had finally found a purpose that didn't require a gun. Beside him, Rex barked once, tail wagging as a group of children watched curiously from the fence. The German shepherd had recovered from his injury quickly, though a small scar near his shoulder remained, a badge of courage he carried with pride. His fur glowed golden under the morning light, and his amber eyes followed Ethan's every move with unbreakable devotion. Grace appeared from the house, carrying baby Noah in her arms. She wore a soft blue sundress that fluttered in the breeze, her long auburn hair cascading loosely down her shoulders. Though motherhood had softened her features, there was strength in her movements, the same quiet resilience that had carried her through fear and fire. She smiled as Noah reached out a tiny hand toward Rex, who sniffed it gently and let out a low, contented rumble. "You're teaching him early," Grace said softly, her voice filled with warmth. Ethan chuckled. "If he learns loyalty from Rex, he'll be in good hands." She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched the volunteers unpack training equipment nearby. Several of them were veterans, men and women with weary eyes and careful smiles, finding solace in the rhythm of rebuilding. One of them, a tall man with dark skin and a prosthetic left leg named Marcus Hill, had served under Ethan years ago. Marcus had lost his leg in a bombing during a rescue mission, but had kept his dry humor intact. "Captain Walker," Marcus called with a grin, his voice deep and warm. "Never thought I'd be taking orders from you about dog leashes instead of combat drills." Ethan laughed. "Trust me, Marcus. These dogs are tougher than any platoon you've met." Marcus knelt beside Rex, scratching behind his ears. "Maybe so. But this one's got more medals than I ever did." The laughter that followed was genuine, the kind that washed away years of tension. That afternoon, the town square came alive again. The seaside diner, once a place of humiliation, was now boarded up, replaced by a newly opened cafe called the Lighthouse Brew. Its large windows overlooked the bay, and the scent of roasted coffee drifted down the street. Behind the counter, Chloe Mason wiped her hands on her apron, her curls bouncing as she leaned forward to greet customers. She looked brighter than before, free. Her freckles danced under the sunlight streaming through the windows, and her laughter filled the room like music. "Next round's on the house, if you promise not to talk about politics." She teased a table of old fishermen, earning a round of chuckles. On one of the corner tables sat Miles Turner, his laptop open, stacks of notes beside his cup of black coffee. He looked different now, less hurried, more grounded. His once boyish face had taken on the quiet confidence of someone who had seen truth change lives. His article, "The Harbor That Fought Back," had gone viral nationwide, turning Blue Harbor into a symbol of resilience. It wasn't just a story about corruption. It was a story about people who refused to be broken. Chloe brought him a refill and smiled. "Still working?" Miles glanced up, his brown eyes warm behind his glasses. "Always. There's a follow-up piece about rebuilding trust in small towns." "Don't forget to mention my coffee," she quipped, setting the mug down. Miles grinned. "Best in Maine, promise." Outside, the townspeople gathered to watch as federal crews dismantled the last of Mendez's construction site, the half-built luxury resort that had once symbolized greed. Instead, plans were being drawn for a community park and a new pier named Rex Point, in honor of the dog who had saved a federal agent's life. Children ran along the shoreline, chasing gulls and laughter. As evening fell, Ethan returned home. Grace was in the garden, watering the small line of tulips that grew along the porch. Noah gurgled in a cradle beside her, his tiny fingers gripping the edge of a blanket decorated with lighthouses and waves. Rex lay close by, ever watchful, his head resting on his paws. Ethan joined her, his arm wrapping gently around her waist. "Carter called," he said. "The investigation's closed. The mayor's facing trial in federal court next month. Mendez flipped on half his crew to save himself, but it won't help much." Grace exhaled, her shoulders relaxing. "Then it's really over." He nodded. "For us, it is." She turned to him, smiling faintly. "They want to honor you again, don't they?" Ethan shrugged. "The town council asked, but I said no. We don't need medals. We've got this." He gestured toward the horizon, where the ocean gleamed beneath the fading sun. From the porch, Miles and Chloe approached, having stopped by after closing the cafe. Marcus followed with his limp steady, carrying a small wooden plaque. "Couldn't convince you to attend the ceremony," Marcus said with a grin. "So we brought it. Here." Ethan raised a brow. The plaque read, "To Ethan Walker, Grace Walker, and Rex, for bringing the light back to Blue Harbor." Grace touched the engraving with trembling fingers. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Rex barked once as if approving, his tail sweeping across the porch. Everyone laughed softly. As the group sat together, the last rays of daylight painted the water in gold and rose. The rebuilt lighthouse atop the cliffs flickered to life, its beam cutting through the twilight, bright, pure, and steady. Ethan lifted Noah into his arms, holding him close. The baby's eyes, blue and curious, reflected the glow of the beacon. Grace leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'll grow up knowing this light." Ethan smiled, kissing her hair. "He'll grow up knowing courage." Rex settled beside them, watching the sea with calm wisdom, as though guarding the peace he had fought so hard to earn. The waves whispered against the rocks below, soft and endless, and for the first time in a long time, Blue Harbor was exactly what its name promised. A harbor bathed in light. In the end, the Harbor of Light is more than a story of justice and redemption. It is a reminder that even in the darkest storms of life, God's light never truly fades. Sometimes that light shines through courage, sometimes through forgiveness, and sometimes through the simple miracle of love that binds a family together. Blue Harbor was saved not only by bravery, but by faith. Faith that good still exists, that wounds can heal, and that broken people can rise again when they walk in God's grace. Just like Ethan, Grace, and their loyal dog Rex, we too face battles every day against fear, doubt, and the shadows that threaten our peace. Yet when we choose to believe, when we hold on to hope and kindness, miracles happen in the most ordinary places, in a child's cry, in a sunrise, in a second chance. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs light today. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and love. May God bless you and your family, and may His light guide your path always. Amen.